Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today here at Kingston Christian Fellowship. We trust you're doing well, that you're being blessed, that you're enjoying God's presence. Look, I'm excited about today's message. Today's message is called Burning Hearts. And first and foremost, we understand God's desire to have relationship with us. We understand his incredible heart of love to engage in relationship and conversation and practicing his presence. And really, the Bible is a story from beginning to end, talking about how God desires this relationship, his incredible love for us, and the extent to which he went to make sure that we could have relationship together. So today I want to look at Luke 24, story about disciples on the road to Emmaus. Let's do some reading. Luke 24:13 says, "Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. Jesus asked them, 'What are you discussing together as you walk along?' They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, 'Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened here in these days?' It goes on. We're going to skip some verses. It goes on, and the disciples explain to Jesus everything that's happened, even though Jesus knows it. Let's pick it up in verse 30. It says, "When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, 'Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?' They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, 'It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon.' Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread." Look, the main reflection, the main verse coming out of this, the main point of the whole thing as I see it is the two disciples spend time with Jesus, not even knowing it. And sometimes that happens in our own life, right? God is always present. He says he'll never leave us nor forsake us, right? He's always there, yet sometimes we don't recognize it. But the one reflection that these disciples give, and man, I pray this is true of you, is that we're not our hearts burning within us. Look, there is a distinguishable effect that God has on us when we spend time with him and spend time in his presence, and it's absolutely wonderful. So, in the church, we talk about fire and passion that comes from a relationship with God. And, often the church will talk about, words like revival, revived, or being on fire. And, all these words to explain what relationship with God, the impact that God has on us in relationship with him, right? These words explain what the disciples on this road experienced. But look, sometimes these terms have been used to cause guilt and shame, to bring condemnation. Like, look, I've got this amount of fire and you've got this amount. So, you need to come up here. And we use these terms in a guilt and shame kind of way. And I'm telling you right now, there is no room for that. There's no room for that at our church. There's no room for that in our culture, because God woos us to himself. It's his kindness that leads us to repentance. It's his unconditional love that draws us into the depths of relationships so that we can experience the burning hearts like these disciples experience. Look, another thing is that this fire and this passion, it's not about excitement. Right? There's not a cheerleader squad that's going to rah you up into an emotional excitement. That's not what this is about. The fire and passion is the tangible life of God that is experienced in authentic relationship with him. Look, you cannot spend time with somebody like God, somebody like Jesus, and not be impacted. Right? He's too wonderful. He's too glorious. He's too loving. He's too forgiving. He's too kind. He's too great and powerful to not come away and be impacted, right? And so he impacts us as we spend time in his presence and as we spend time with him, and our hearts burn. Look, there was a divine inspiration, a divine motivation, a divine passion that impacted these disciples in God's presence. The encounter with Jesus turned the disciples' lives around. If the beginning of the passage talked about they were downcast, etc., and then there was a significant change and a different expression from after they experienced Jesus. All right, so the Hebrew writer in chapter 12, verse 29, the book of Hebrews, the Hebrew writer writes this: "For our God is a consuming fire." And I love how the Hebrew writer uses the word "for," right? For our God is a consuming fire. What's he illustrating? The cause and effect. Things happen because our God is a consuming fire. Time spent with God, time spent in his presence has an effect because he is a consuming fire. Look, it's hard to spend time by the fire and not feel the heat. Whenever you spend time close to God, you're going to feel the heat of the consuming fire that he is, and hopefully you catch the fire as well. Look, we've got a fire pit in our backyard. My family and I, we have a few acres, and the fire pit in the backyard. We enjoyed a fire this past summer, and after dousing the flames, it was time for the girls to go to bed. After dousing the flames, we come inside, and we have 6 resin Adirondack chairs that we sit around this fire pit. And, there's a back window where I can constantly check on the fire, making sure that it's not reigniting, everything's safe, et cetera, et cetera. And so I took a peek out a little while later and noticed that the wind has blown one of the resin Adirondack chairs into the coals. Now, look, we all know what fire can do. We all know the impact that fire can have. And I knew what coals and hot fire can do to a resin Adirondack chair. So I threw my shoes on, I ran out there, pulled the chair out. Sure enough, when I looked at it, it was misshapen. The fire had impacted the chair. It had melted the plastic and misshapen the chair. And look, the fire, God's fire, our God is a consuming fire. Man, it has the same impact on our lives. It can change things. It makes a difference. It makes an impact. And it's so wonderful that the fire has an impact on us. You simply, again, can't spend time with someone like Jesus and not be impacted. He is too incredibly wonderful to spend time with him and not come away being impacted. So look, when we start to move out of this Christianity by works, or simply working Christianity as a system or as a shape or a form, we're not just another organization that has policies and procedures. When we can move beyond that into the life-giving relationship with Jesus, then we begin to experience his characteristics and they guide our life. God always meant that intimate relationship would be the way that we would live. When he impacts us, we then live in a manner from his impact, right? Look, I don't love people because I'm told to. Like the Bible tells us to love people, and that's a good thing, but I don't love people because I'm told to. I love people because the incredible love of God has ministered to me and impacted me. And now it's not a fight, it's not a work, it's not a burden to love people, because God's unconditional love has been poured into my life and I've experienced it in tangible ways. That love now pours out of me into others. That's an incredibly awesome way to live, and the way that God has intended it, that you would experience him in incredible ways, and then that would pour out of your life into others. Look, if the church promotes experiencing God's presence, why is it so important? And as we wind down, I want to give you 3 points of why it's so important to experience God's presence. And number 1 is simply because of the pleasure. God desires to have relationship with you. You are his beloved. Spending time in his presence is so beautiful because he pours out affirmation and acceptance, because he pours out incredible love. And that's very pleasurable, right? Just the love of God being poured over your life, knowing you're accepted, you are valuable, you have a position in the family. These incredible things are extremely pleasurable. In fact, David felt the same thing where he said in the book of Psalms, he says, in your presence is the fullness of joy. The fullness of joy, the fullness of enjoyment is where? It's in God's presence. In that place of intimacy with God and presence with God are all the incredible characteristics of God. The Bible says that God is love. All these tangible things that we experience, right? And not just a little, right? It's the fullness. David says it's the fullness of joy. It's the center of joy. It's the source of all joy. In fact, the Bible is full of men and women who testify to relationship with God, who testify about the enjoyment and the fulfillment and the impact of what relationship with God is like, what it contains, and the incredible fruit that comes from it. So one is pleasure. Why do we encourage practicing God's presence and being in his presence? One, because it's pleasurable. Two, because your emotional and mental life will be impacted, right? Verse 17 says the disciples were downcast. After meeting with Jesus, they were no longer downcast. The presence of Jesus had ministered to their downcast state. Look, the presence of God ministers to who we are, body, soul, spirit, mind, will, and emotions, right? God's presence impacts us in all of these areas, blesses us, brings healing, affirmation, security, faith, trust, all these sorts of things. God impacts us in his presence. Number three is your purpose, right? The witnessing, the testifying of God's goodness. These disciples ran back to the other disciples to testify about how they had experienced Jesus. Look, with passion, they testified to the other disciples about their experience with Jesus. Their experience translated into inviting others into that experience as well. Two very important notes here as we close. The impact God has on us always, listen to me, always impacts others. Always impacts others. And spending time in God's presence will directly forward the purposes of God in your life. So number one, first and foremost, it's pleasurable. It's what God has created us for, relationship with himself. Too often we run ahead and use God as a tool or as a weapon or as a resource, but that's not initially what relationship was for. Relationship was to experience the depths of each other's hearts and just be together, right? So number one is pleasure. Number two is your emotional life. God blesses us, body, soul, spirit. Again, in his presence, we are ministered to in all these ways. And number three is your purpose. The thing that God has created you for will be illuminated and will fast forward in your life when you spend time in his presence. Look, there was a significant difference in the disciples after they met Jesus than before. And this testifies to the impact that practicing his presence makes in our own life. Awesome. Last point. Here we go. Last point. Even though Jesus had only been gone for 3 days, these disciples were mourning over the loss of being with Jesus, right? It had only been 3 days, this story says, since Jesus died, and these disciples were mourning the lack of God's presence, the lack of being with Jesus. Do you today feel like you've lost the experience of the pleasure of God's presence? Has it been a while since you've experienced the presence of God? Has it been a while since you've practiced that relationship or participated in the enjoyment of that relationship? Has it been a while since you felt the closeness? So look, he never leaves you and never forsakes you, but you can engage in relationship and conversation and practicing his presence. Has it been a while? Look, God's not mad at you. He's not angry because it's been a while. He just loves you so much. It's time to re-engage. It's time to practice his presence and to enjoy the pleasure of his presence, enjoy the fruit that comes with it. God bless you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll see you next time.